Welcome back to the Tech Talks Daily podcast, a place where you can keep informed of the latest business and tech trends by listening to stories of other people in your field and how they are overcoming challenges with emerging technologies. Join me in learning from the guests actionable tips and lessons learned to obtain greater clarity on how you or your business can leverage technology. So in today's episode, Daniel Kaar from Dynatrace is going to be joining me on the podcast, and he prides himself on bringing a new AppSec category to life. But after reading recent research that revealed that 75% of CISOs are currently worried that too many application vulnerabilities are leaking into production, despite their multi-layered security approach, combined with the fact that 79% of CISOs say continuous runtime vulnerability management is an essential capability to keep up with the expanding complexity of modern multi-cloud environments, I invited Daniel on the podcast to discuss that research and their annual survey of 1,300 CISOs located in large organizations around the world. So buckle up and hold on tight, because no matter where you're listening, I'm going to beam your ears all the way to Austria, where Daniel is waiting to share those insights. So a massive warm welcome to the show. Can you tell the listeners a little about who you are and what you do?
Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. I'm Daniel Kaar. I'm with Dynatrace for almost 12 years, so quite a bit, but I held several roles in that time over the years. For me, what I love doing is essentially launching new products, and this is the third product I'm launching here at my time at Dynatrace. I work very closely with customers, help them to understand the value that our product brings to them, how it can change their daily work, their lives, helping with customer conversations in general, with demos, proving the product in their environments, in their day-to-day work, do on-hands consulting. And then also over the years, I help, scaling and coaching others, enabling and all those kind of things.
Awesome. And we'll find out a little bit more about that new product a little bit later, maybe in the conversation too. Yep. But the main reason that I invited you on today was I read that you recently released the 2022 CISO Report, and I wanted to take a closer look at some of the insights with you today. So to begin with, can you tell me more about the report, who you surveyed, and maybe offer a little background on it?
We surveyed 1,300 CISOs of larger organizations, meaning that organizations with at least 1,000 employees. And essentially, in summary, the research revealed that the complexity created by cloud-native technologies and multi-cloud environments, and the variety of coding languages, and the use of third-party libraries, and essentially the structure of modern applications are making vulnerability management and analysis a lot more challenging than it used to be.
And looking at the report, the big stat that really jumped out to me was that 75% of CISOs are worried about too many application vulnerabilities leaking into production, despite a multi-layered security approach. Can you expand on some of the findings there?
Yeah, so essentially the big takeaway is that there is a lot of worry that despite already having multiple controls in place, vulnerabilities still make it into production, right? And I think that will always be there because organizations still have to ship code, release code, right? So there is pressure from a competitive perspective, right? I need to bring out new updates, new functionalities, new features to stay competitive, right? And sometimes that's even a risk that's taken willingly, right? So essentially, you look at what's the risk and can I still release and then manage the risk, right? So I guess the way you should look at that to essentially live with that situation and address it, right? So manage the risk, look at, have solutions in place, and most importantly, have a layer in your layered security approach in place, also in production, to look at those vulnerabilities and or uncover them as they move into production, right? So I think that's also that highlights the growing need of observability and application security to converge, right? Because observability essentially also already is in that place, right? And now can expand into the application security area. Maybe the one last thought here is that also cloud native, the adoption of cloud native technologies like containers or Kubernetes, or in the entire shift towards containerization also introduced areas that can't be looked at with traditional security tooling, so that also that introduces the need for additional security toolings or additional layers in your layered approach to also address vulnerabilities coming from those angles.
And something else that I learned from that as well was that open source software code can actually leave the back door unlocked, as Log4Shell proved. With, I think it was 95% of organizations they said that they faced a risk of exposure from that event. So how can security teams still use open source but ensure that they're still protected? Because they still need to use it, but it's just a case of increasing security, right?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, Log4Shell was a big one and a very tangible example. But I think it's important to understand that this is not necessarily just about open source, right? Because pretty much, open source can't be blamed here, because pretty much any code that anyone ever writes could introduce, an unlocked backdoor. You know what I'm saying? I think what essentially is the case with third-party libraries is they become way more interesting for hackers because they are more adopted. And in the case for Log4Shell, 95% of organizations use that library with that vulnerability, versus if I have an unlocked backdoor in my own proprietary code, only I am vulnerable in that one single app where I introduced that by accident, right? It makes it way more interesting for attackers because they become aware of it. They know about the adoption of a certain library, and then they have a much bigger chance of, attacking and intruding. I mean, a few months later, there was then, for instance, a Spring4Shell, right? It's pretty much same principle, but less impactful because used only by 60%, for instance, of Java developers, right? The recommendation, I think, or the takeaway of, answering your question really now is to be really diligent about the libraries that you use, right? You just have a hard look at them, what you really need, and what you could solve otherwise. Also make sure you upgrade them frequently, right? For some reasons, it's very normal for people to update the browser or make sure they're always on the latest iOS version. But when it comes to open source libraries or third-party libraries, there needs to be the same thinking about that, right? So make sure and dedicate resources to that, to always update and make that an effort, right? Pay attention to security fixes and apply them.
And also, I think we all admit now that cloud is absolutely everywhere. And yes, it has enabled innovation, but it's also increasingly difficult to spot vulnerabilities with so much going on, everything scattered in across multi-cloud environments, etc. So can you tell me more about how even layered security strategies can contain gaps?
So if you think about the software development lifecycle, it's sort of a linear line, right? Where people start writing code, then they check it into the repository, then deploy it for the first time, test it, and then run it through multiple stages all the way into hardening and eventually in production. There is different tools and security controls can be applied in all those different areas or stages of the life cycle, right? And they all are designed to find certain vulnerabilities better than others do. And that's not necessarily just because of the nature of the tool, but also what angle you have in that stage, right? So to provide for instance, a little bit of a tangible example. So let's say in the very beginning, everybody pretty much does static code analysis, right? The static application security testing. And I would like to think about that. This is like running a spell checker or a grammar checker against an encyclopedia, right? It's a large book. It's very easy to do because you have everything in front of you. I think a very tangible example to do in an early stage, right? Look at what's in front of you because it's easy. You have access to it. But pretty much what the study says, and also maps perfectly with the experience we have talking to customers and the market, is the further you move along the software development lifecycle into your first deployment all the way into production, the less adopted security solutions become, and that introduces that natural gap towards the end of the life cycle, right? Maybe one more thought here, and that gap was traditionally solved through security controls at the perimeter, right? Think about web application firewalls and security even at the edge. And one of my customers essentially said, the perimeter was very tangible when people operated their application in-house, right? And with moving to the cloud, the perimeter went away to some extent. And one of my customers said, it's like taking the party outside. I think that's also a very tangible example to think about it. So moving on here and going back to the encyclopedia example is, wouldn't it be better if we knew what articles in that book are the most interesting ones for the audience to read, and then focusing on those, making them researched better, semantically correct, all the way down to simple grammar and spell checking, right? And that information only can come with adding, the essentially in application terms, consumption and usage information, right? And you only have that in runtime. So that's a testament or the need why you have to include runtime information and how your application is used in the assessment of security. And again, this became really, really tangible with the Log4Shell example, right? The most pressing question that everybody had when Log4Shell came or was published is they wanted to know, is my application that I'm running right now in production affected, right? And that can be answered with everything that I just said. And only as a second priority, they wanted to understand better where in my code repository do I have that, right?
And before we started the podcast today, we were just talking about how in our personal lives, notification fatigue on smartphones, and we're bombarded with constant notifications, and some are useful, some are not useful. And of course, in security teams, relentless alert storms actually blind those teams to the real threats. And on average, I think organizations receive something like 2,027 alerts of potential application security vulnerabilities each month. And I've been a part of security teams. I've seen where they come in and the security teams will go through their checks first thing in the morning and go through all the alerts, and then they end up getting dragged into something else from firefighting a problem that's affecting users throughout the company. So the question is, how can teams know which threats should be treated as a priority? Because it feels like there's got to be a better way of handling that.
Yeah. Essentially, what that question sort of reiterates or boils down to is the focus, right? Where do I focus when I get so many alerts or notifications, right? And I think that can be well answered with adding context, right? Or better said, applying additional context and analyzing that, right? And the beauty of that is also that can be AI powered, right? And this essentially means when, again, going back to the Log4Shell example, because it's still on top of everybody's minds, right? So let's say, and again, some of that I shared when answering the previous question, but let's say Log4Shell is uncovered in your running application, right? The first question is you have is, to what extent I'm impacted. And then you try to mitigate that, right? And AI can help with that because that's a structured, repeatable analysis that needs to be done, right? You start, analyze the applications. How many users do you have on it? Is there an instance that's exposed to the outside, exposed to the internet? Is there any data source at risk here that's nearby? All of that can help to automatically assess and prioritize the criticality of the occurrence in your application, really.
And obviously, you live and breathe this space, and I would suspect that you've seen most things many times before. So, did anything in the report surprise you?
Yeah, I would say no, but I'm also, you kind of indicated that, right? But I'm also a very bad sample to ask here. Essentially, the survey really confirmed what the team around me and I saw over the last 2 years, right? So I started to take our application security offering to our customers roughly 2 years ago, and the findings that we had along that period very much maps to what the outcome of the survey was, right? But even back then, it really didn't really surprise me because it's just a really, really tough problem to crack, right? And traditionally, application security solutions were focused on the left side, right? I kind of indicated with the spell checking. It's easier, more straightforward to do. It's just an easier approach from a technical perspective to get done and implemented, right? Versus doing the analysis at runtime in real time, it's much harder. But the beauty of it is that the observability technology has that footprint already and knows how to tackle that problem. So it's essentially that the essentially problem was solved. Now it's all about applying that mechanics to the application security market and areas and solve that gap through that angle.
And I think that the report also suggests that organizations still lack real-time visibility into runtime vulnerabilities, but 79% of CISOs say continuous runtime vulnerability management is an essential capability to keep up with the expanding complexity of modern multi-cloud environments. So, I mean, we've covered a lot today, but is there anything else you can expand on that will just help any business leaders listening a better way forward?
Yeah, I think first of all, I think yes, that's absolutely true. It's I think the stats indicate that every 2 or 3 years, the number of instances, or let me say this differently, the cloud footprint doubles, right? So the amount of applications that people are running in clouds or in the cloud setup doubles. I think we've addressed a lot of things from on that before, but I think that gap isn't kind of natural, right? Because it's a hard problem to solve, right? And this is essentially the market trend that's happening right now, is that take the observability approach and apply it to application security, right? And solve that problem from that angle. I think it's safe to say that most organizations now have adopted a modern monitoring observability type of approach for the digital service performance, monitoring and management. And it's really now about applying, expanding that beyond observability into application security, and leveraging also that as a cultural change agent to go into a DevSecOps culture, and combine that with AI and automation is a very strong angle on solving that problem. As a summary, I think observability can the observability approach provides the groundwork here to solve this gap.
So I've got to ask, what's your big focus at Dynatrace, and what makes you hopeful about the future too?
I think the biggest focus is our customers, the customers I work with, and the people around me that I'm working with every day. And essentially, I think that we have a industry-changing product, and a product that can truly change, people's lives on a daily basis as they investigate security problems, as they investigate and analyze vulnerabilities. Beyond that, or based on that, I think my biggest focus is to move the market forward, right? And it's essentially not, try to build on existing approaches, but together with the product team, really challenge the status quo and bring innovative solutions to the market, right? And the second part of your question, what makes me hopeful? I think we are in a really, really good position to repeat in the application security market what we've done more than a decade ago to the observability market, right? To modernize that, revolutionize that, and become a market leader for many, many years to come.
Well, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today. Now, before I let you go, I always like to step away from the tech and find out a little bit more about yourself there. And obviously, I think you said you've had, 11 successful years or over 11 successful years at Dynatrace, and none of us are able to achieve any amount of success without a little help along the way. So I'm going to ask you, is there a particular person or someone that you're just grateful towards that's helped you get where you are today you want to give a little shout out to?
Yeah. I think that's a great question. And if you want to think about a single individual, you always forget 1,000 others. And this is why I think that the best way of answering the question is broadly, right? And I think that starts with your origin family, right? With your parents, your siblings that you spend pretty much the first years of your life with. And then obviously also teachers, right? I think they are underappreciated in many cases, right? So it's also about the teacher who facilitates your interest in math, right? Or creates a sparks in something that you never thought before, right? And then you move on, and then it's professors and lecturers and colleagues that make you interesting in program a microcontroller, developing your own software, bringing new ideas to life and all of that, right? And then it becomes friends and people you randomly meet in, airports, planes, spend dinner conversations with, right? So I think I had many of those encounters over the years, right? And only met a person for an hour or two, and I still think about those conversations and the ideas exchanged, right? So I think it's really, really hard in the end to put that on one single person. And then eventually it becomes your own family, right? Your kids, and also goes back to your original family, because you need that support for your own family. So I guess there is 1,000 people to be thankful for.
Wow, that is a beautiful answer, and possibly the best answer I've ever heard to that question. And I think all too often, many of us are guilty of not looking back and thinking about the people that invested time and has helped us, shape us, and get us where we are, the impact that people have had on us over the years, and also that role of serendipity and those accidental meetings. Incredible. But before I let you go, Daniel, for anyone listening, maybe wanting to check out that report, maybe wanting to check out Dynatrace, or even contact your team, what's the best starting point for everything?
Right. So I think that's a standard answer. Go to our website.
Yeah.
Dynatrace.com. Try out the product. You can find that directly there. Get your hands on the product. I think that's a really good recommendation, because the product tells a very powerful story. Reach out to us. Also, that is pretty easy on LinkedIn, Twitter, any other social media channel. I think that's it pretty much.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, Daniel, for discussing the findings of Dynatrace's annual survey of 1,300 CISOs in large organizations around the world, illuminating some of the key issues and sharing some of the stories and best way forward, and also for that beautiful answer. Thank you so much.
Sure. Thank you. It was great chatting with you.
So remember, keep your questions, insights, musings, insights, anything at all coming over to me. Let's keep this conversation going. And finally, before I leave you all, a big thank you to Daniel for sharing his time with us all today. And an even bigger thank you to each and every one of you investing your time to listen to this podcast. And I cordially invite you to join me again, and we'll do it all again tomorrow. But until next time, don't be a stranger.